So, we are ready to start our chilling adventures at William Blake Lodge, and to begin that, we are going to have a class on witchcraft, which you would think would be something that would come up at OTO bodies semi-routinely, but doesn't seem to, actually. So why this class and why today? Well, witchcraft has had a recent resurgence of media popularity. At least that's what people say. I don't think that statement makes a ton of sense because it's had a resurgence of media popularity since like the mid-90s and has been pretty steady. But there's been kind of a renewed aggression with it now that there's this whole Instagram witchcraft fashion thing and pop stars who dress up like witches and kind of treat witchcraft as a fashion rather than a thing to do. There's a whole new spate of TV and movies with witches having come out. They just remade Suspiria. There's like 4 shows on Netflix right now that are witchcraft themed. You've got witches popping up left and right. And of course, amongst those Netflix shows is The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which has been hugely popular, but outside of being popular, has had kind of an interesting space and impact in the neo-pagan and the occult communities. You get a very sort of divided position of people who like absolutely love the show and people who think it's the worst thing ever and is going to destroy all of the ability of people to be witches in America. And I think what's funny in looking at that is, and it seems like most people have come around to realizing it's fun. It seems to be less and less people complaining about it. And you're even seeing a lot of occult groups and bloggers and authors posting stuff or writing stuff about it. And I think part of that is it's really a better depiction of witchcraft than most things on television and most movies. Even people who like it are like, well, it's a fun show, it's really cool, it's got this neat aesthetic with kind of this old classic church vibe, but then made all goth and satanic. But clearly it's all fantasy because it's like supernatural witches that are cannibals and Satanists and stuff. But there was a article recently that Matt Oren did on Pathos, where he interviewed one of the writers who is a witch, and that writer noted that almost everyone in the writer's room for Sabrina does magic of some sort. And when you look at it, there's not just that a lot of the spells and rituals that are in it are things where you could take that and with just a little bit of tweaking, it could be worked into an actual magical ritual. A lot of the references and a lot of the ways they describe things end up being things that are sensible descriptions and sensible answers to magical questions. So part of what we're going to look at today is the juxtaposition of fact and fiction and of modernity and of history in terms of witchcraft, because there's a huge divide between modern witchcraft and historical witchcraft, and we'll look at how kind of fact and fiction sort of play into that. But as far as the fiction end, Sabrina's going to kind of guide what we're looking at fictionally. We're going to look at things that pop up in the show and how they relate to things in actual witchcraft. Another reason for this is it's Holy Saturday. So the church is dead, Christ is in hell, and man gets to stand before the divine in a way that's different than it is any other time of the year, because God is in his lowest point of human experience, experiencing all the suffering and torment and sin that is capable of being experienced through humanity. And what I've always thought was really interesting about that from a mystical perspective is that you're in this place where there's no longer a mediation between man and the divine. Man and the divine are in almost a self-same spot. And the idea of mediation is destroyed with the church being dead. But in that, being that this occurs through Christ's harrowing of hell, and going down into hell, and Christ becoming essentially the Lord of Hell, Mary becoming the Queen of Hell. That it's kind of a way in which blasphemy becomes sacred and heresy becomes holy. So it's been a theme that's popped up occasionally with events here at Blake, that for Holy Saturday or Easter Saturday, we might do something that kind of is a little bit blasphemous, because blasphemy is sort of empowered almost in a sacramental way through certain interpretations of Holy Saturday. There's another element of it that with Christ descending into hell, certain elements of hell are sanctified and empowered. So in certain traditions, certain spirits and certain demons gain additional power on Holy Saturday and are able to be accessed in a more powerful and a simpler way. And then all of those elements of hell and damnation are also transmuted through the resurrection tomorrow morning. So you can go out and sin as much as you want, and it's like a sacrament today. And we all know I love sacraments. Another reason, honestly, it was to piss people off. There are some people who have a hard-on for bitching about William Blake events and the fact that occasionally we are a little less than serious.
Sometimes we have fun.
Yes, and sometimes we do actually pretty awesome, serious occult stuff beyond the comprehension of those people that bitch. But
Don't hold back, DJ. Say what you believe.
oh, I'm going to be a sassy bitch tonight. So,
welcome to William Blake, everybody.
So,
sit down and put some chairs up for you, just so you know. Okay.
I think one thing that's good to note is something that Richard Kaczynski says a lot, is that sacred isn't always somber. Sometimes you have to recognize that there can be things that are humorous in the sacred. There can be things that are meaningful from a mystical or magical perspective, and you can still find humor, you can still laugh, you can still have fun while doing them. I think an important part of both mysticism and magic is understanding that the world is absurd, and that if you try to undermine that absurdity and try to manage that absurdity all the time, then you're fighting this like uphill battle, hamster on a wheel, Sisyphus with a rock kind of thing. But if you embrace that absurdity and are able to engage it in a way that empowers you and lets you take control over the absurd to some degree, that's an important element of gaining mystical and magical power. Now, I'm a relatively serious guy in a lot of ways, and so I'm not like doing silly Alice in Wonderland invocations or anything like that, but I think there's still space for understanding the absurd in magic and understanding humor and fun, and that if you can't explore your spirituality or can't explore things through those lenses, then you're missing out on a large part of them. And so that was, in all honesty, part of the gestation of the idea for this class. In addition to witches having a moment, the devil is also kind of having a moment. There's a lot of places in the media where you're seeing more friendly portrayals of the devil. And now, in this case, the devil is sort of that conglomerated modern religious figure of the devil, Satan, and Lucifer, which historically they are not the same figure.
Plus, they threw Baphomet in there, only Baphomet had no breasts.
Yes. And so yeah, you're seeing more things with Baphomet in the media, more things with the devil in the media, more positive depictions of Satan and Lucifer. And in addition to that, you're also seeing in the occult community where there's less of that knee-jerk, no, there's no devil in the craft. No, the occultism has nothing to do with the devil. There's no Satan. We don't believe in that. That's a Christian thing. I think some of that may have to do with the fact that you're also getting a lot more occultists who are recognizing that they can be occultists and still embrace Christianity while embracing other religious traditions. And so the devil and Satan and Lucifer become interesting ways of exploring sort of the other side of the coin of that Christian mysticism. But notable figures like Jason Miller just recently did his Sorcery of the Devil Arcane Audio. Gordon White also recently did a class on the devil. I think there's been a handful of other notable occultists who have done devil classes recently, and they've been very popular, whereas this is something that wouldn't have been as popular in occultism 5-10 years ago. Now, as far as the devil goes, for me personally, since I'm the one teaching this class today, and the class is the way the class was titled on Facebook. It kind of highlighted the devil because that was the initial thinking, but we cover a bunch of different elements of witchcraft that show up in Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and talk about what the history is, what the modern interpretation is, and then what it would be if you're taking historical witchcraft and approaching that as an actual thing. So the devil isn't the only thing we're going to cover, but as far as me as the presenter goes, the devil is not like a central thing in stuff that I do, but at the same time, in some ways, is. When I was growing up, definitely did not think of the devil as something that was part of the witchcraft that I did. Did not think of the devil as something that was part of the magic or occult stuff that I did. And definitely in terms of working with ceremonial magic, it's not really a part of that. But as I got older and came to understand the witch's devil as opposed to the devil of modern Protestant Christianity, I realized that, oh, well, this majorly important figure in most of the work that I do is the witch's devil, and is a major part of my own personal magical work. But I've always thought of him more as the black man of the forest, or as the black face, and the devil as a way of understanding that came later. Also, since we're going to do a ritual where the vast majority of the script comes from a TV show, this is like my first time doing that. I usually am not a pop culture guy as far as magic goes. But I do think it's important to look at how magic is depicted in pop culture, because it can be really inspiring and exciting. So while normally I wouldn't necessarily like design a ritual based on something on a TV show, I might watch a TV show and get my juices flowing and be like, oh shit, I should go do some magic with this thing. In this case, the show just happens to be written by magicians, and so almost all of the magic in it is very easily translated into something usable. So, witchcraft, fact, fiction, modernity, and history. Before we go deeply into any of the topics, I'm going to just note, especially since we have a lot of people that are new, my opinions on witchcraft, I talk about generally in smaller groups and with very select people, like with Allison, because my views on witchcraft tend to be a little bit controversial and are not at all in line with the mainstream. That is not to say that anything I'm going to say about witchcraft is intended to exclude anyone from being counted as a witch or considered a witch. It's that I have a very specific view of what falls into witchcraft and what doesn't in an historical sense. And I understand that there is a much broader modern view of that, and that there's a lot of space in between as those views kind of juxtapose and intermingle with each other. So some of the stuff I might say may seem kind of controversial. Some of them may be things that you won't necessarily like. But again, not intended to suggest that anyone is not should not identify the way that they identify. So, one of the things that stands out to me in terms of modern witchcraft is this idea of witchcraft as an expression of feminism. Witchcraft isn't really a feminist rallying cry. Historical witchcraft, not particularly empowering for women, mostly just people getting killed. But even when you look at it from the witching end instead of the persecuting end, witches weren't thought of as leaders of society or powerful, beneficial figures or matronly chief-like people. Witches were scary supernatural monsters that lived on the edges of the town, and that you weren't really sure who could or couldn't be one. It wasn't something that people wanted to be. It wasn't something that you thought of as like, oh yeah, I want to feel powerful in my womanhood. I want to be a witch. There were probably other ways to do that depending on what level of society you were in at the time. There's definitely figures through history that were women who did attain forms of empowerment and often are kind of coded in ways that connect them to the other, connect them to some sort of outside space that is maybe a little frightening to people in society at the time, just because it was something that was different from what was normal in society. But they're usually not coded within the area of witchcraft unless they're being called witches to take away their power, like Jeanne d'Arc. But for the most part, it wasn't really that. Even within modern witchcraft, when you look at the beginnings of it, it's not particularly a feminist-friendly story. You've got Gerald Gardner and Aleister Crowley as sort of the progenitors of modern witchcraft. Crowley is such a diverse and dynamic character, it's really hard to say where he was on anything. He definitely said a lot of things that were empowering and positive for women, but he also did a lot of things and wrote a lot of his rituals and structured his organizational things in ways that were not necessarily the case. And then Gardner, that's a criticism that seems to be levied against Gardner frequently from people who were in those circles at the time, that he could be a bit of a pervy old man, that there was definitely, while the goddess and the high priestess had roles of power and importance, it was almost like Crowley and the Scarlet Woman. You had Gardner and his high priestess, and there was definitely a sense of him being in charge of what was being put together. And when the Book of Shadows was rewritten, to some degree, Doreen had to wrest that control from him and kind of take over and be like, no, we need to write this as something that's actually workable and not you just regurgitating Crowley. But looking at things with that, it definitely doesn't come off like, yeah, this was the space for women to be empowered, at least not until a little bit later. Even looking at Parsons as like another thelemic expression of witchcraft, Parsons kind of blurs the lines between adoration and objectification in terms of his view of women. Parsons' view of women definitely was not healthy, and nothing that happened with the women in Parsons' life was healthy or treated them like people with agency or treated them like people who were as important as Parsons was saying they were. They were treated like objects. And even in terms of conjuring Marjorie Cameron, it wasn't like, I want a partner. It's, I want a woman to be the vessel for this divine thing for me to do my magic stuff. So I think it's kind of interesting that witchcraft became this feminist thing, but I think it's something where we have to recognize that it wasn't necessarily that until like the 60s. Already noted that it wasn't something that people historically wanted to be called. Cunning folk weren't witches. Cunning folk worked against witches, typically. When you look at even people in a more contemporary time frame, in the last like 50 to 100 years in the United States, there's people who did folk magic and still do folk magic that has been sort of reclaimed by elements of neo-pagan communities. People who historically grew up in those folk magic contexts would not call themselves witches and would have been like pissed off if someone called them a witch. It was not like a positive thing. So again, it's sort of an interesting thing that the word witch has been, again, reclaimed into something that is a positive, empowering thing. I think there's something interesting and useful to that process. But I think in terms of discussing modern witchcraft versus historical witchcraft, there's also an element of when we say that the word has been reclaimed, can you reclaim something that wasn't yours? So if the word was a word that was used to describe the other, as opposed to describing the mainstream or things that were inside the society, then can things that are inside the society claim the word and say it's theirs? It's the same thing sort of when you have, when you talk about people from a more privileged position can move into the experiences of people in a less privileged position. You can go through and try to mimic the experiences of people that have less than you, but it's hard to go in and, as someone who has less, and mimic the experiences of people who have more than you, because you don't have the leverage in order to do that. And I think to some degree, that's been kind of the modern history of the word witch, is that it's something where people are in a position where they can say, hey, if I want to say this is what I am, if I want to call my magical practice witchcraft, I can do that. And I think we've gotten to where people want to be able to kind of define it however they want to define it, because we're in a place where it's comfortable to do so. And that can be fine. I think it's just important to sort of recognize that. Because again, that's going to be important when we look at how things play out, when we look at modern things versus traditional things. And in looking at those things, I think one example that we can look at in terms of historical witchcraft versus modern witchcraft is the idea of religion. We're seeing more of a resurgence of people who are practicing witchcraft in a non-religious way. A lot of the traditional witchcraft movement is very clear that their witchcraft is not part of neo-paganism and is not part of necessarily religious witchcraft, even if there's elements of it that could be considered religious or could be considered religion in kind of an academic approach to the idea of religion. But there's not that same claim that witchcraft is the survival of some ancient priesthood, because it's not. The most ideas around that have been debunked, and when we look at history of witch-like figures in pre-Christian times, they're still outsider figures. They're still not figures that are part of the insider religious institution. So again, modern witchcraft being tied to neo-paganism is one of the ways in which witchcraft historically is fairly different from what modern witchcraft is. Then ceremonial magic, I think, is another element that creates a bit of a difference. A lot of modern witchcraft stems from Wicca, which itself stems very much from Thelema. There's differences and there's some separation, but Gardner definitely was pulling some of his ideas from his experience with Thelema. There's definitely rituals that draw from Thelemic ritual, and a lot of the structure of Wicca's degree system is modeled after Thelema. So all of those ceremonial magic elements, if you think about somebody who is the sort of historical person at the edge of the woods between the civilization and the wild space, who's doing magic in their hut, they're running around doing lesser banishing rituals of the pentagrams with consecrated knives and things like that, or are they making some rope out of straw and tying knots in it? Probably the latter. So I think when we look at what witchcraft would look like, it definitely looks a lot more like folk magic. And I think there's a popular element now of trying to say that it would look like the magic of cunning folk, because a lot of people try to distinguish between cunning folk and between literate magicians. But cunning folk were clearly literate magicians. We frequently see amongst cunning folk the surviving materials owned by cunning folk copies of the same magical texts that we would see amongst the aristocracy. We see things in the notebooks of cunning folk, which, because they're keeping notebooks, they're literate. The things that are copied from those same learned books of magic. So the cunning folk tradition is still a literate tradition of magic. Although I don't think that necessarily the literate tradition versus a non-literate tradition of magic needs to be the dividing line between witchcraft and other forms of magic. When we look at a lot of the people who are historically in trial records that make more sense to look at as far as getting an idea of what witchcraft would look like. Because you can sort of read between the lines on some of the trial records. Some trial records, you read them and it's like, okay, this is clearly just bullshit, and it's just something that was made up by the people who were trying to murder somebody. And then there's other trial records where it's like, this is probably real, but is painted with bullshit that's made up by people that are trying to murder somebody. And you can start to kind of decode some things in some of the trial records and look for some things that are consistent, some things that make sense from a practical standpoint. And generally the people in those records are people where when they're describing the magic they're doing, it's very clearly folk magic stuff. It's not folk magic blended with grimoire magic, which is what you see more with the cunning folk. And of course, you do have some cunning folk that it is just straight up folk magic. It's not that same blend. But suffice to say, modern witchcraft, a lot of the ritual, a lot of the practice is very much tied to the grimoires. It's very much tied to the Kabbalah, tied to the Golden Dawn system of magic, and that's probably not what historical witchcraft would have looked like. Lee Morgan, who wrote Deed Without a Name, said, no, that's not a Lee Morgan quote. That is from the guy who wrote Sabrina. I should probably have made a note about who said the quote. In the interview with Matt Oren, one of the screenwriters said that witchcraft has always been fact and fiction. That you can't necessarily say that fictional things about witchcraft need to try to match up to factual things about witchcraft, because there's always been this fictional component. There's always been stories. There's always been folklore. But then there's always been the stuff that actual witches do. And they're not always the same, but maybe they relate to each other. And I'm not 100% sold on that statement, but I do think it has a lot of value. I think magic definitely requires a space where the mythic and the observable meet, where you can engage something and it doesn't matter as much as to whether or not it is historically real or whether or not it's the way that things fully unfolded, but it expresses something that is real through the way that it tells a story. And I think when that mythic space and that observable space meet, that's where the myth becomes something that's operable for magic. When you just have the mythic space on there as its own, as just a story that people tell, it's nice as a story. It might tell you something about the world. But when you try to experience the mythic space within the context of something that's clearly real, then that's where you begin to engage in ways that make changes in yourself and in the world around you. Magic requires tension between the imaginal and the known. We talked a little bit earlier today about the idea that part of the force of magic and change in the universe is based on dynamism and tension between different things and different polarities that are in opposition to each other. The fact that things move and pull and push against each other, and that there's this space between things that both separates them and connects them, that creates a dynamism that allows for exchanges of motion and power and change. And so similarly, when we look at what could be or how something could be understood that's not what we see in front of us, and we look at what we do actually see in front of us and what is the way that things are, then that creates, again, that space where the magical can happen, where we can begin to change things, we can begin to bridge between the imaginal and the known, and make the imaginal into the known. One thing that I think describes magic is the idea of telling lies that become the truth. You're basically saying that something is, even when it's not the case, in order to make that thing so, which is a way in which the imaginal and the known meet. Witchcraft specifically is also connected to this magic that deals with that space in between things. Witchcraft is a particularly liminal magic. Not all magic is based on liminality. Liminality in some way touches or is important for most magic, but the actual operant agency of witchcraft, I believe, has to deal with the liminal and has to deal with that cleared space in which something is not one thing or another thing, but is in a state of motion between multiple things at once, in which it's inhabiting simultaneously both poles. without actually inhabiting either. And so that relationship between fact and fiction is kind of something that goes hand in hand with witchcraft. What I think it doesn't mean is that we can invent any fiction and run with it. Myth and folklore aren't the same as fiction. Fiction can be anything we want it to be. It can be something that's fully made up, whereas myth is something that, whether it's true or not, it still tells us the truth. Folklore is something that, whether it's the actuality of what something is or not, it's still based on the observable. It's still based on things that we experience as a people and as a community. And so I think when we look to determine what the concept of a witch is, that's something where we need to look at that blend of myth and fact. We need to look at what's historically been the case. We need to look at what's historically been the understanding and the superstition and the belief. And we also need to look somewhat at what the reality of today is. We need to look at what the modern understanding is and how that juxtaposes to the historical understanding, and find the space in which those things all come together in order to have something that's practically usable. So the first thing that comes up in Sabrina that I think people like to toss out as this is part of why the show is clearly fantasy is they deal with hereditary witchcraft. Historically, the idea of witchcraft having a connection to heredity is a pretty basic, pretty common witchcraft idea. But it's not a popular idea in modern witchcraft for the most part. I think there's more space for it in traditional witchcraft, but it's hugely unpopular in neo-pagan witchcraft. For me, this is a little bit of a personal issue. I grew up with the idea of hereditary witchcraft. It was something that was always part of witchcraft folklore in my mind. I've never. It was never something where it was like, oh no, clearly that's just something that was made up as a modern thing. It was just like, oh yeah, no, witches, they're born as witches. Within my own family, my mother is the seventh daughter of seventh daughter, which is one of the folklore things that could define someone as a witch by birth, even if it wasn't inherited from previous generations. Her family also does a lot of folk magic stuff. I didn't grow up around my mother's family, so I didn't know that till I was an adult. So I'm not claiming to have grown up taught magic by my mother's family, and I'm not telling old grandma stories. But from what my mother's told me is that's created things in how she interacts with her siblings, because she also didn't really grow up with them, and so her lifestyle is very different from them, and so a lot of them have kind of this like uneasiness about her disapproving, because while they know she doesn't practice magic, they think, well, someday she's obviously going to start because she's a witch and she's going to be more powerful than them and be able to fuck them up if she doesn't like what they're doing. Another element of that is when my mother was a very little girl, she used to get locked in a closet routinely for being a witch. So the first foster home that she was in, because she was the seventh daughter of a seventh daughter, the woman who had that home would lock her in the closet, call her a witch, and tell her to stop giving her the evil eye and to stop doing witchcraft on her when she was like 4 years old. So again, in my family, in our experience, the idea of witchcraft as an inherited thing is something that's just normal. My father's family, there are a lot of people who are on the edges of magic there. My father himself wanted to do magic and wanted our family to do magic. Did a spell once, left all the stuff out for my mother to find when she came home so that he could use it to start a conversation, so that he could see if she'd get into doing magic with him, and we could be a family that did. This was before I was born. And she came home and was like, you fucking Satanist, you get that shit out of our house. And so they did not do magic. But he bought me my first magic books. One of my cousins was like the first person that I made a magic wand with. Another cousin worked at a magic store for a while. There's goddess images up in my aunt's house. My great aunts were proud of me for hanging out with pagans and witches when I was in high school. So both sides of my family, This is kind of the thing. In talking about witch blood once, my father just assumed I was talking about his family because that was just the assumption there, was that was the thing in his family. So for me, witch blood has always been an obvious idea. Also, most of the magicians that I knew when I was younger and like first like really learning magic from other people were people that came from sort of those traditional outlooks, and a lot of them were from families where that was a thing in their family as well. So again, it was just the norm. Now, in terms of people claiming this idea of witch blood, a lot of you are probably familiar with Rufus Opus or Josh Gadbois. He is one of my best friends. When I was on his podcast, we talked about witch blood, and he was like, dude, what is this idea? You talk about it. It's nonsense. I explained it a little more. He's like, okay, that makes some more sense. More recently, he has suggested that part of the problem with the idea is that the only people who believe in witch blood are people who claim to have it. Which I think is one of the things that a lot of people dislike about the idea, is that it looks like a way that people can try to make themselves better than other people or try to make themselves special. I think there are people who acknowledge the idea who don't claim to have it, but that aside, I actually think a lot of hereditary witches are eccentric and odd, and they do magic that's bullshit and shouldn't work, but does, and it annoys the fuck out of me. And I don't maintain a huge group of hereditary witch friends. Allison is my hereditary witch friend. And also, I would say I'm a fucking brilliant magician without witch blood. Most of my magic is not witchcraft. So I don't think that I need to necessarily rely on that. Why, though? Why do modern people dislike the idea? I think modern witchcraft is very much about empowerment and egalitarianism. And a lot of times when I say modern witchcraft, and I apologize to those of you who are of traditional witchcraft backgrounds, most of what I'm going to say about modern witchcraft is more about neo-pagan Wicca, particularly eclectic Wicca. But I also know that it's not necessarily all eclectic Wiccans or not all neo-pagan Wiccans or witches who hold these views. But one of the things from the beginning has been the idea that everyone can be a priest, everyone can be a priestess, everything is equal. There is no going to some priest or priestess in order to have to be a mediator for you, because everyone is their own priest or priestess. There's this idea that you suffer and you're weak and the world is against you, and you can turn to witchcraft to find power and to find a way out of that weakness and a way out of that suffering. And I think that is very true for witchcraft historically. I think that has always been an important part. But if you start saying that there are people who are born as witches, then that undermines that egalitarian idea. It also undermines that idea of empowerment, because you're suggesting that there are people who have power, and then there are people who need to get power. And I think that's a little bit of a misunderstanding of the idea, and we'll get to that a little bit. But I think that's why people don't like it. I think there's also an element of modern witchcraft needs to sound scientific. It needs to sound like something that can be acceptable in a modern materialist concept. It needs to sound acceptable to people who want to look at everything through a lens of science. And when you start talking about people being born under certain conditions or people being born into certain families, it looks like superstition, because it is superstition. And we need to not be superstitious. We need to not have the supernatural in our witchcraft. We need to not have the supernatural in our magic. We talked about that a little bit earlier today with the psychological model of magic, that as we got into the later part of the magical revival with Crowley and Fortune and Rigardi, that it was important to make magic look science-friendly and to cut out things that looked supernatural in magic. And I think that's another part of why the idea of heredity needs to be cut out in some people's minds.
I call bullshit on some of that, because the power comes from within you, whether you were born with it or not.
And that gets to a later distinction that I'm going to come to, that it's not necessarily about being better. It's about
not.
it's a different context entirely. The concept is an enduring concept in fiction. Bewitched, both versions of Sabrina, Beautiful Creatures, Vampire Diaries, basically any fiction that has witches, has hereditary witches. And I think that's because worldwide, witches work in that concept within folklore. That's just the general concept of witches in folklore. It's only within the magical community that it operates differently. The criticism that's often levied is that witchcraft is a craft, so it can't be inborn. It's something you do. So weak play on words. But craft also means power. It doesn't necessarily mean something you do. The actual word craft, or craft, that we take the word craft from, can refer to a type of power or an ability, not simply a set of skills or actions that someone learns. One of the possible historical meanings of the word witch is to bend. And so if you interpret witchcraft as the power to bend, then it can be interpreted as the power to change things and move things to the way in which one wants them to be. It can also be interpreted as a description of the concept of bewitchment, which I think is central to understanding the idea of witchcraft. The first magical lesson that I had as a child was on bewitching animals. The second one I had was on bewitching people, which I thought was super normal until I got to college and was talking to friends about the night before my first day of first grade. And I was like, my dad sat me down and taught me how to look at people so that I could like command them and make them understand that I was more important than other people. And my friends were like, what the fuck are you talking about? And I was like, didn't your parents do that before you went to school? And they were like, no. But that's just fucking weird. And
It's not weird, it's just not normal. Okay, never mind.
but a lot of the idea of doing that was sort of fixing something in which you create a connection through the gaze and then sort of shape or shift your understanding or perception of things in order to, through that connection of gaze, shape or shift or bend the person that's being bewitched. So to me, I think that power of bewitchment is one of the things that is a key element of witchcraft and is at the core of the word, and sort of also undermines the idea that it's something that is a craft you have to go learn. Another criticism is, why isn't there a witch gene? If witches are born, or if witches are hereditary, then there should be some gene, and if we've, it should show up on 23andMe, like you're 93% more likely to be a witch because of your genes. I love that one. It's true. So I think the easy thing to say about that is there are trends in families that aren't genetic. There are talents that aren't genetic, but that still show up routinely in certain families. Some of that's going to have to do with environment, and some of it's going to have to do with context, but there's also things like that where we can see someone who grows up removed from their family and then they still have these traits and behaviors that show up. The other element of that is metaphysical heredity doesn't need to necessarily be genetic. It's sort of like saying, well, there can't be a magical explanation for magic. It has to be in your genes if it's hereditary. But for blood also seems to have power beyond what we can know through science. Anyone who's done magic involving blood before knows that there is a particular power to using blood in magic, that generally when you're looking at everyone. When you use blood in magic, a lot of times people talk about just using a little bit because blood magic is very potent. I've always understood that from the time that I was a child, that the reason that blood magic is potent is because you aren't simply transmitting some wave of energy or some thought form. You're taking the actual energy of life in your body, shaping that towards what you're trying to use, and then physically expelling that from yourself in order to create what it is you're trying to create. that blood is able to do that suggests that there's some metaphysical thing tied to blood as well. Blood also sustains life. I don't know how true this is anymore, but I know when I was a teenager, one of the things that came up in discussing the idea of blood magic was that if you were to take synthetic blood and try to replace all of someone's blood with something synthetic, it wouldn't be able to sustain them. We can do things to replace portions of people's blood, but you still have to have some natural blood in your body in order to be alive, which suggests that if we can mimic blood, but we can't mimic it perfectly to keep people alive, there's something we don't understand about blood. Hereditary witchcraft is not the same as family traditions. The concepts are very, very different. So when in the 90s, I know this was like a big thing where people would, and before the 90s, 90s is just when I was around. Prior to the 90s, I was too young. But, I mean, going back to even the advent of modern witchcraft, there were stories of like, I was initiated by my grandmother who cut my balls with a knife in order to initiate me, Alex Saunders. And or some other thing where it's like they knew some old lady who helped teach them witchcraft, or they went someplace and there's this their parents told them, oh, we've had this secret tradition in our family for years, and now you're going to learn it. There used to be like email groups for people claiming to be from family traditions and stuff. And hereditary witchcraft is a very different thing. Like in my family, we've had discussions where it's like my mother will like occasionally accept that she's a witch, but doesn't practice witchcraft. But there was never a point growing up where it was like, oh yeah, we're witches, so this is normal. Like it was more like, hey, this is how you deal with the animals that are coming into the yard. This is how you deal with people that are around you. This is how you deal with dreams that are bothering you. This is how you know these things about the weather. Which is still like not even necessarily what you're going to have happen mostly. Mostly it's just you got people that are weird and magic shit happens to them and they probably have the sight. And there may be no actual tradition of magic that's passed in their family. It's just they have a family that has these weird features and they can kind of manipulate people around them. And would you say that is...
Yeah, my family's Protestant and they would not want to be called witches.
But same description in terms of like
they can see
weird
stuff,
eccentric people with
and they know when people died and all sorts of weird stuff.
I'm assuming, David, you probably have a background like that in your family.
Oh yeah,
Yes,
I
yeah.
would definitely not.
Right. So I think hereditary witch families usually, until the current generations, would not call themselves witches. They would not say they have family traditions, and it's definitely different from where you've got neo-pagan kids that are second or third generation neo-pagan kids who've been taught their neo-pagan witchcraft from the time they're kids. It's like it's more of a life is weird, and I need to go figure out how to deal with like this shit that I see. But the good thing with that is growing up in a household where everybody has that, it's not so bad. Because then you have a family that can kind of support, like, oh, you had like this dream or vision, or oh, you felt this thing when you touched this person. That's normal. We'll deal with that. Or at least that's how it was in my house. I don't know about other houses.
I always got your aunt's going to call, and then the phone would ring.
So I think when we look at history, witchcraft historically generally is viewed as occurring three different ways. You either have witches who are born as witches because their family are witches, which is why witchcraft accusations often were accused against whole family groups and not just one individual. I have an ancestor who was tried, convicted, and survived, but it was the whole family that was tried and convicted, not just the one person. But I think that was something that was fairly common, as you had groups of people, usually of family connection, who were tried because there was that belief that it was a thing that happened in families. Special birth conditions, being born under certain signs, which actually is also a criteria for magicians in a lot of medieval works. magicians can elect to become magicians, or you can have people who are born under certain astrological conditions that predestine them to be magicians. But you can be both in medieval and Renaissance magic. Witchcraft, electing to be a witch in a medieval or Renaissance condition or time frame would have been the third option and would have been done by a pact. So it wouldn't simply be you woke up one day and you were like, hey, I want to be a witch. I'm going to go learn some herbs out in the woods and start doing witchcraft. You would either be born that way, be in a family that was made you born that way, or you would make a pact with a fairy or a pact with the devil, usually involving having sex with one or the other. And then they would teach you magic if you weren't being taught it otherwise. If you go back to Greece and look at witchcraft in Greece, because it's probably the oldest thing where we can compare something and say, like, yeah, definitely witchcraft. Witches, again, are hereditary in Greek witchcraft. Witches typically descend from Helios. So most of your major witch figures in Greek literature are not usually children of Helios, but frequently are grandchildren or great-grandchildren of Helios. And they are taught witchcraft by Hecate. So you have this kind of interesting dynamic that witches are titanic, which is kind of like they're of the devil. But you have witches have titanic blood instead of divine blood, and witches are taught by a titan. But the particular titans that they're connected to are titans that are also othered. So Helios is one of the titans that's part of the natural forces, natural forms of existence in the world, and so does not have to necessarily pick a side in the Titanomachy. Hecate is not one of those titans that is a natural force. She's the daughter of a titan that is. And she's sort of got some sort of badass ranging position even as a titan before Zeus gives her a bunch of power as a goddess. But it's not really specified or clear what her purview is as a titaness. But she is one of the first titans to come over to the gods and say that she's going to side with them in the war. And so she's given special place because of that. But at the same time, she's sort of othered from the gods because she's a titaness. And so like when we first see Hecate in connection with Demeter and Persephone, she's kind of just wandering around by herself. She's one of the only people that knows what's going on because she's just out in the world and sees shit. Some people say that in the story of Persephone, Helios and Hecate are the only people who know what happened because they're the sun and the moon. But Hecate isn't associated with the moon in that story. In the earliest classical depictions of Hecate, she's not associated with the moon at all. She's just this badass titaness who Zeus is like, fuck, that's awesome, you're on our side. I'm giving you rule over everything. It honestly makes very little sense. But
She bewitched him.
yes. So when you look at other witches after like Medea and Kirke, you start having witches who are less in like the mythic sphere and more in sort of like the Greek folklore and fictional sphere. And those witches usually still have some connection to Helaic blood and are still connected to Hecate. But you also see witches being associated with certain places and also typically with certain families, or where you may see some sort of figure whose parent was a witch, and there's elements of their story that relate them to that witchcraft. So there's still that heredity component, even going back to early Greek myths. In most cultures, why do I have this here?
Should we be at all concerned about what's in the oven?
No, it'd probably be turned down a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe like 325.
I mean, is it screaming or anything?
It's not screaming.
It's not anymore.
Making sure it wasn't bursting the flame, that's all.
So it's
Just checking.
so Witches generally were beings who exist outside of the framework of normal societal magic, and are often described as something which is human, but also has features that sound like a spirit. And this is something that's not just in a Greek context or in a European context. When you look at the anthropology of witchcraft and explore traditional cultures around the world, the figures that anthropologists associate with witches generally are ones that are described where it's like, are they talking about a person or are they talking about some sort of demonic monster? And it's almost always in this in-between state, which again gets to that importance of liminality with understanding the concept or nature of the witch. Witches were typically adversarial, and that they took from the rest of society. They weren't part of society, and so the magic associated with them is obtaining elf shot and killing livestock, stealing milk, stealing grain, stealing wealth, stealing health. What? Yes. But it's not simply about being crooks, it's about understanding a society in which things have clear limits, and the understanding is the only way to obtain something is by transferring that to something else. And so witchcraft had an element of being able to move a quality from one thing to another. So a witch could take health from someone for themselves, but they could give that health to someone else. So transference was an important element of that, not simply the adversarial nature of it. But that context also had much more to do with sort of the understanding of resources in traditional societies. Acceptable magicians had spells to fight witches and to prevent bewitchment, prevent the effects of witchcraft. And as we talked about before, it wasn't something that you generally wanted to be, because it was the thing that people were against. And I don't know why that's in the reality of the heredity section. But to get more clearly towards that, the Benedati and the Maledonti are examples, again, of traditional culture, traditional views of witchcraft, in which it's something that's generally inherited and is not a choice. Benedati, in some accounts, didn't necessarily know what was going on with them at first, that they would go out on these visionary battles and then come back, and it wasn't something where they're like, yeah, I'm going to learn to go do this. This sounds awesome. I'm going to go fight werewolves in the night. Like, it was just something that would happen to them because that's who they were. But they're an interesting case because Benedati were often part of society and could be considered acceptable. There were even points where there were trial records where people were not persecuted for anything because they were considered Benedati instead of some sort of more negative type of witch. The idea of witch marks is another thing that shows up as far as witchcraft being hereditary throughout history. You have the concept of witch mark as it relates to a familiar and feeding the familiar, but there's also the idea of a witch mark as something that can be identified at the birth of a child in order to determine that that child is a witch. So being born with a cowl, being born with a tail, webbed feet, devil's peak, witch's peaks, or being born hairy were things that often were considered as marking a child as being born a witch. Again, if the idea was a wholly new idea based on charm to the craft, I'm pretty sure in the Middle Ages they didn't have charmed or the craft, and so they wouldn't have been looking for children born with cowls to determine if they were witches. Two figures that are popular in looking at witchcraft trials, Bessie Dunlop and Isabel Gowdy. Both of those are figures where there is sort of a family element to the accusations around them. In Isabel Gowdy's case, it was her husband and her mother-in-law who initially introduced her to the devil and to witchcraft and brought her into the witch coven. In Bessie Dunlop's case, I believe it was her child was sick or her husband was sick, and there wasn't a solution until a spirit approached her and taught her the magic to use in order to cure them. And what's interesting is the spirit doesn't seem to have been related to her, because I think she ended up having to go do something in the next town for the spirit related to his family. But the initial trigger for her having to begin this engagement with the spirit and learn magic from the spirit and becoming a healer or a local witch had to do with healing members of her family first.
Wasn't that coming from familiar spirits?
Yes, it is. Talk about it.
It was a husband and a child.
Oh, both of them are sick.
The spirit, the familiar predicted that her husband would recover, her child, and her child would pass. Which was true.
Thank you. When we look at the idea of heredity in modern witchcraft, the New Forest Coven, by most accounts, required people to prove witchcraft ancestry in order to become members of the coven. Horsa, one of the traditions of modern witchcraft, claims to be the tradition that was practiced by the New Forest Coven. They still maintain that as one of their rules, at least the last time that I spoke with anyone from Horsa. That was still the case for them. They claim also that Sybil Leek was a member of Horsa, and Sybil Leek, in her own writings, talks about heredity and witchcraft, talks about her family and witchcraft in her family, and is very much in line with views that were prior to modern paganism, that witchcraft pretty much equated to the site, that they sort of went hand in hand. In Gardnerian witchcraft, the original coven requirements also required proof of witch ancestry. The earliest iterations of Gardner's Coven utilized that because they were drawing from the rules of the New Forest Coven. Eventually, they dropped that and developed the process of initiation and lineage, which I have always interpreted to be a form of conspiratorial witchcraft. Conspiratorial witchcraft is the term for coven-based witchcraft that involves initiation through a pact. But that they use a form of conspiratorial witchcraft as an alternative to heredity. So you still have passing along the lineage, but it's an initiatory lineage instead of a birth lineage. Modern occult writer Nikolai Friesvold, who wrote popular books on Obia, Kimbanda, Palamayamba, has also wrote a book on traditional witchcraft. One thing that he frequently says in his texts is that witches are born, sorcerers are made. In looking at his writings on Obia, a lot of the sorcery that pops up in that system looks very much like things that would pop up in traditional witchcraft, both contemporary traditional witchcraft and historical traditional witchcraft, which could also be because Friesvold has a connection to that as well. But he deals with it in the sense of the major difference between the two is about transmission of power. In systems of sorcery, power is transmitted through infection. Power is transmitted through gaining access to a group of spirits as part of the process of that infection. Julio Cesar Odi, yes.
Just a quick time check. How much longer do you think we have? Because we were supposed to start the half of the night ritual a while ago.
Oh, jeez.
I mean, I know we started late because we're waiting for people, but
I will try to go through fast.
awesome.
Okay. So, Julio Cesar Odi writes about his initiation into Bakor systems in Haiti, in which spirits are written into the bones of the magician, and they learn secret passwords in order to summon those spirits out from their bones in order to work sorcery. The way that Friesvold kind of deals with that difference is that that same sort of spirit connection is inborn in the witch, and that same power that's transmitted is transmitted along family lines, whereas for a sorcerer, power is transmitted through that initiation or through that infection with spiritual presence. The way that I've understood that is witchcraft frequently connects to magic related to the dead, and so the mechanism for hereditary witchcraft would be an inborn connection to ancestral spirits in your blood, as opposed to having to create a connection to ancestral spirits through magical acts. Lee Morgan, author of Deed Without a Name, who I accidentally mentioned earlier, in an interview recently with Gordon White, talks about how witches and magicians are in some ways different. And that gets to the idea that it's not necessarily about being better, it's just about a different type of magic. I think one of the things people don't like about the idea of witch blood or hereditary witchcraft is the idea that if there are people who inherit this type of magic, well, they must be better at magic, they must be more powerful. But no, it's like any other talent. You can be born with a talent or born with a draw to something, but if you don't use it or you don't explore it or you don't develop it, you're going to be shit at it eventually. And people who work at it are going to be better at it than you. What Gordon and Lee kind of come to in their discussion, and anyone who hasn't listened to the Rune Soup interview with Lee Morgan, I find very few like interviews or books on witchcraft to be things that jive with like what I'm like, yes, that's it. That one, the whole thing, I'm like, yes, this is awesome. Definitely check that out.
Sorry, which book was it?
Lee Morgan is being interviewed by Gordon White on Rune Soup. So in that they talk about that it's a quality or character of the magic that's being done that's different. Witchcraft has to do again with that liminal space and that kind of queering of polarities, which not all magic has to do with. So even when a witch is practicing magic that is using some other system of magic or using some particular mode of working, it's approached through that modality of interconnecting with the things that are being worked, interconnecting with the thing that's being worked on, and reshaping the space between those things in order to create the change in the thing, as opposed to other forms of magic where it's about calling a spirit and telling the spirit to go make a change, or building up a thought form and projecting the energy towards making a change. It's kind of an more intimate, interconnected, visceral type of magic that's based on sort of that wild natural potential, as opposed to going out and learning correspondences for things and then applying them. Kind of already talked about how it works. Witches as othered or as supernatural monsters. One of the other major themes of Sabrina is that the witches are separate from the rest of society. They have their own school that they go to. They have their churches of darkness. They have this almost shadow world that they exist in that other people don't know about. And again, this is one of the things that people look at and they're like, the show's cool, but it's clearly fantasy. Now, it would be awesome as fuck if you had a secret school for witches to go to. As far as I know, that does not exist. Maybe I'm just not cool enough to be there. David, please give me the invitation. That place is real. But the concept of being othered is something that has always been central to witchcraft historically. I think one of the things that's difficult with that is the concept of othering is not a concept that's part of American culture, despite the fact that Americans other people like crazy. Othering is a way of viewing and defining someone as different to the point that they are not connectable, that they have to be outside of the space and range of everyone else because of whatever makes them not the same. And witchcraft has always existed within the space of the other. One of the things that I like to say is if you're not a supernatural monster, maybe you're not a witch. That came up initially with talking with Ian Corrigan, former Archdruid of ADF, in which he said that it was silly for me to assert that we need to look at historical documentation of witchcraft in terms of defining witchcraft, because if you look at historical witchcraft, witches would all have to be supernatural monsters. To which, well, we are. To which my response was then, well, maybe if you're not a supernatural monster, you're not a witch. But what does it mean to be a supernatural monster? Clearly you're not running around with your hands on fire, flying with a crown of thorns on your head, proclaiming that you're the Dark Lord's sword.
Not right now.
I mean, again, I might just not be that cool. If the rest of you can do this, I want to see it. That would be awesome.
It's a lot of work.
Yes. But I think I remember when I was like first being introduced to magic books, and one of the things they talked about is that there's no such thing as the supernatural because everything occurs within nature. And that's a really fun idea when you're a kid, but it's really useless because supernatural clearly describes a certain series of phenomenon, and if you take away the definition or word for that phenomenon, how are you going to describe it? I don't think necessarily that we have to say that all of magic has to fall within the supernatural or the preternatural, although all of magic definitely butts up against that at the very least, if not falls within it. But I think the idea of determining witchcraft as being something that is within that space of a supernatural monster is that being a witch inherently positions oneself as being different because the witch is in the border space. So when you look at the space between the tame and the wild, when you look at the space between the spirit world and the waking world, when you look at the space between civilization and the woodland, between in the group and outside of the group, the witch is always someone who is in between those spaces and navigating those spaces in a constant state of flux. I think that is the way in which we can understand something as supernatural monsterhood. Your average person doesn't want to be in a state of flux. Your average person doesn't want to be in a border space between the spirit world and the regular world to the point where their magic and their interaction with the spirit world puts them in that place where it's like, are you operating as a spirit or are you operating as a person? And yet that's one of the things that comes up with witchcraft. There was actually recently a really interesting blog from out of the traditional witch community that dealt with that, that when you look at historical witchcraft and when you look at a lot of the more visceral iterations of contemporary traditional witchcraft, that it is very much about blurring that space between operating within the spirit world and operating within the regular world, that it's very much about that hedge-riding position that is associated with witchcraft. And this again goes back to that idea that witchcraft is inherently liminal. So again, magic can operate from spaces that aren't liminal, but that's what, to me, defines witchcraft as witchcraft, is that it operates specifically from a liminal space. And when we look at the gods associated with witchcraft historically, again, Helios and Hecate, these are liminal figures. They're figures that are between the space of being titanic and divine and being forces of nature. Hecate, in particular, is a goddess of transitions, of liminality, of actions at a distance, being able to be remote from something but being able to affect something, being able to maintain, open, close the gateways between things and allow flows between different things. The Queen of Elfame is human-like but is a spirit. She's part of the invisible fairy world, but that fairy world is a world that's parallel to our own and is quasi-knowable by our world. She exists between the spaces of the living and the dead. She is both nameless and named. The devil. Is the devil a demon or a nature spirit or something between the two? The devil is also someone that generally exists at the edges of space. You go to the edge of your town to meet the devil. You go to the crossroads to meet the devil. You go to the churchyard, but not the church itself, to meet the devil. To cemeteries to meet the devil. Is the devil man or animal? Or is the devil between man and animal? All of the figures from whom witches draw power and from whom witches draw their connection are figures that are about this liminal space. When we look at mythical witches, Medea, she is both a hero and a monster at the same time. She is a figure who is immensely powerful and needed for success, but she's treated like an object that's barely valued. She is, and then that fact that she is both of those things at once are core to her agency within her own story. Kirke is both a seductress and rejected. One of the major stories of her or several of the major stories of her magic deal with her drawing men in and men also not desiring her at the same time. So again, liminality is something that is at the core of witchcraft. With the Benedante and the Malandante, you have again that space between human and spirit and between man and animal. Whether you're looking at riding fennel stalks into battle, or whether you're looking at being a werewolf, you're dealing with that space that's in between two different things, between the spirit world, between the world of man. The spaces of witchcraft are liminal spaces. Again, we've talked about the crossroads, the cemetery, the churchyard, the edge of town, the edge of the forest. Caves, where you are within the world, but also out in a space that's accessible to man. Seashores are one that I don't think is actually mythically or historically connected to witchcraft. Like, I couldn't think of an example of a seashore as being a traditional witch space, but I think, at least in my consciousness, seashores are something that are connected to witchcraft.
So when you are talking about witchcraft, you're talking more European, Western?
Yes. Yes. And although the idea of the space between being a supernatural being and being a person is something that occurs in other traditional cultures as well, not just in European cultures.
Irish tradition, the seashore is very much associated with witchcraft. Yep.
So there you go. So the seashore is hugely liminal space. The nature of witch and witchcraft, again, as I've mentioned before, I think is something that is inherently queer in the nature of its liminality. Not queer in a sexual way necessarily, although we'll talk about witchcraft and sexual fluidity in a little bit if we have time to get there. But in a polyvalent way, in which, again, the witch is something that is occupying multiple spaces without actually occupying any of them. And that is the nature of that power. The witch is that same essential dynamism that's created by the polarity between things, but within a person instead of within the world at large. And I think most of the rest of that is just explaining the same thing. Familiars and the dead. So Sabrina, I think, does an awesome job at dealing with familiar spirits. It's not a campy talking cat who is a criminal witch being punished, like in the old series. It's not pets. It's clearly demons that are posing as spirits. Or posing as pets. Posing as animals. So in modern witchcraft, if you go on any witch forum or any large witch forum where it's going to be just like your average folks, you're going to have once a week or so, everyone post pictures of your familiars. I want to see your cuddle bunnies. And it's the lamest, most annoying fucking thing in the world. For anyone who is listening to the recording of this that believes that their cat is their familiar, no. Mr. Snuggle Wumpkins is not your familiar. He is your cat.
So how do you define familiar in, I guess, so how do you define familiar as opposed to the show, like you said, it's demons in the show, and like
So
cats aren't your familiars or animals aren't your familiars?
it's a good question, because that is the very next thing on the notes, is what is a familiar? A familiar is a spirit who assists a witch or magician within some sort of ongoing arrangement, often for the life of the magician. So when we look historically, familiars are actually one of probably the best recorded things that we have in Western magic, because almost every magical text talks about how to get familiars. If we go back to the Greek magical papyri, and Allison could run circles around me with that, there are modes for getting spirits who are like your personal assistant, but then there are other spirits that you can contract with you to do other tasks as well, and that personal assistant can bring in spirits to work for you and manage those spirits also. When we look throughout basically any of the grimoires or any of the books listing spirits in Europe, They talk about the spirits being able to give good familiars. They talk about how many legions are under those spirits. And it doesn't matter whether the spirit is a demon or whether the spirit is an angel or something in between. They all are able to grant familiars, and they all have legions underneath them. When we look at more folkloric elements and at some accounts of witchcraft, you have fairy familiars, where instead of a demon, a fairy is conjured as the familiar. The familiars that the devil gives sound like fairies, and there are some scholars who believe that when people were describing them, they were discussing fairy beliefs, and that trial records were amended to make them into devils in order to suit what was needed. I think there's also cases where you have parallel trial records where there's the official record and then there's an informal, like, secondary note taker, and the record of the secondary note taker will reflect more of the fairy faith element of it, as opposed to the "we supped with devils and then had sex with them" element that appears in the more official trial records. So, are familiars animals? No, but in folklore, spirits typically pose as animals when they're familiars. Agrippa was described as having a great black dog that was actually a familiar spirit that was bound to him, that I believe died when he died. It's something that occurs both in accounts of witchcraft and in accounts of magic. If you look in Discovery of Witchcraft, which is mostly really about Catholic folk magic in Britain at the time, and more so than it is about witchcraft, although delineating between Catholic folk magic and witchcraft can be difficult too for that time period. There's a lot of stuff on calling on the dead and binding them to your service, calling on demons, binding them to your service, using the dead to call on fairies and bind them to your service. It's a consistent thing in magical literature that spirits are called on and bound to serve the magician. There's lots of different ways in which it's done, and that depends on the system the person is using. I think another element of the animal conflation, though, is a lot of the animals that are associated with familiars, particularly cats and toads, are animals that have magic body parts. And so throughout history, you would have instances of magicians taking those animals, killing them in a ritual way to get a special bone or special part that the animal has, and then using it for magic. So the idea that those animals became associated with common witch familiars makes sense. When we look at the idea of pets as familiars, again, we have tons of writing about familiars throughout magical history. None of that writing reflects the idea that pets were familiars ever, or that familiars were actual animals. What we do see, that I'm pretty sure none of these people posting pictures of their cats on Facebook do, is that when a familiar takes the form of an animal, that familiar needs to be paid with sustenance in order to allow it to continue to maintain that form and continue working for the witch. And that's done by cutting oneself and allowing the familiar to drink your blood, which is something that goes back to really old stories of demonology, back to the Near East and like the earliest accounts that we have of demons from that period. The idea that spirits that are some of the easiest to connect with and some of the first that a magician might connect with are spirits that would live off of your blood. In the Testament of Solomon, Orneus is feeding off the blood of a young boy who happens to be the favorite of King Solomon, and King Solomon uses Orneus in order to explore the rest of the world of demons and gain his power over the demons, which is not exactly the same as a familiar spirit. It's a slightly different concept, but still related. Other elements of caring for a familiar in historical magic, in addition to feeding them blood, a witch or magician might be expected to have sexual congress with their familiar. I think in the witching end of things, it was sort of treated as this is something that they're compelled to do as part of their pact or agreement. In some of the learned or ceremonial magic, it was more you conjure the familiar because you want a spirit to have sex with. The other things that come up, you may have the familiar bound to an object in order to give it some sort of home. There may be offerings that are made to a familiar on a regular basis. If the familiar is a dead human, then you may resolve some issue for them as part of paying for their services as familiar. So again, as mentioned earlier, Bessie Dunlop had to go to the neighboring town to do something that was unfinished for her familiar. One of the examples that pops up frequently that shows up in Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft is the idea of conjuring a dead criminal and then offering rites for the propitiation of their sins in exchange for their magical service. It's all a ruse, though. You actually burn them ritually in order to destroy their soul, but you tell them you're going to do nice things for them. Probably not the best way to go. So how are familiars obtained? Sometimes they occur naturally. Again, Bessie Dunlop meets the dead person and develops this familiar relationship. Fairy familiars often operate this way, in which the person encounters a fairy, enters an agreement, the fairy teaches them magic. They may be obtained through a pact with the devil. Isabel Gowdy is an example of that, and after tonight, you will all be examples of that too. Or it could be done through ritual magic. Again, as we said, most angels and demons provide familiars. Most magical texts talk about how to get them. We've already gone through types of familiars. What do familiars do? Well, obviously your pet doesn't teach you magic, but familiars teach you magic. Rebecca has a very good relationship with our lodge familiar, and quite frequently I've suggested that she ask it to start teaching her special magical secrets,
Probably should.
because that would be very interesting.
It just makes them tasty.
Some of my earliest experiences with magic involved a spirit that I first encountered when I was about 3 years old, and by the time I was about 6 or 7, that spirit had started introducing me to nature spirits and teaching me to interact with those nature spirits for magical things, which resulted in me having a reputation for being magic by the time I was in like 2nd or 3rd grade. But one of the roles of the familiar is to introduce you to other spirits. So in addition to teaching you magic and teaching you to navigate the spirit world, your familiar also will help you find spirits that you need to work with and show you how to contact those spirits, how to work with those spirits. When people ask, how do you get into witchcraft? I often feel that the best answer, instead of going out and finding a bunch of different books, is to go out and sit in nature and learn the flows and patterns of nature, learn what the feel is of nature and the energy and pulse of nature, and get to the point where you are what one of my teachers used to call a good animal, where you can sit in nature without disturbing it, and then you can begin to listen for the spirits in nature. And so if there's not a spirit that has introduced itself to you already, that's a way to pursue that, and then that spirit can begin teaching you magic and begin teaching you witchcraft. They execute spells and execute the effects of your magic. So one of the main reasons for having a familiar was to send the familiar to go do magical tasks for you. So instead of necessarily calling up a spirit or doing a spell to accomplish something magical, you tell Pyewacket to go and do whatever it is that you need done. Obviously, Mr. Snugglewumpkins won't be as effective for that.
So maybe I must have that.
They can also help navigate dealings with other spirits. So if you have something where you've asked a spirit to do something, a familiar spirit can go out and help work with that spirit in order to make sure it's doing what's needed. And it can also help keep you safe. If there are other spirits trying to encroach into your space, trying to bother you, your familiar spirit will help protect you from those spirits. When you have dealings with spirits and those dealings may not go as you're expecting them to, your familiar spirit may help with protecting you from any sort of negative interaction with those spirits. One thing that comes up frequently in people trying to call out the idea of pets as familiars is that familiars take magical hits for you. I've noticed it's always used in that precise terminology, and no one can ever tell me where this idea comes from. So I think it's just something that's become repeated on the internet. I think there were a lot of elements of magic for deflecting magical assault off of a magician onto an object historically, so I'm not familiar with the idea of familiars doing that, but it may be something they did. The dead can be familiars, but they can also just be part of the cohort of spirits that witches deal with regularly. Sabrina does a cool job with this also in dealing with the little children at the Academy of Unseen Arts, where she's able to use them to assist her in magic and to gain information from time to time. That's one of the things that is typical for witchcraft. In Greece, witches were associated with necromancy. They weren't the same as a goddess. They weren't the same as other necromantic figures. But that was one of the stock and trade elements of witchcraft, was that they would dismember corpses and use them, or reanimate corpses, or do other necromantic things. I think in contemporary witchcraft, the answer to that tends to be ancestor work. I don't know that there is a clear historical base for ancestor work being a central part of witchcraft specifically, as opposed to other magic. David, do you maybe have anything on that? So what I was saying, ancestor work, I think, is central to the idea of witchcraft today as an alternative to pure necromancy. But I don't think that there's necessarily documentation that we can go back and say that witches historically, that ancestor work was specifically tied to witchcraft as opposed to other forms of magic.
Yeah, well, Greece, there was such a confusion and blending.
Right. It overlaps so much.
Like all ancient Greeks having ancestor worship, but, you know, in the home where it was respectable, and then the witch was the one who was like going into the battlefields after everyone was dead and dragging the corpses out.
Right. So I think that connection to the dead is fairly well established, but ancestor work makes more sense for most of us as a way of dealing with that connection. Dining with the fairy world is another thing that links up to the dead. The dead live in a space that's adjacent to the fairy world. There is quite a deal of overlap between fairies and the dead historically, and one of the things that typically happened for witches was
Wait, before you stuff out now. I'm not here, BJ.
Oh.
BJ. However, BJ, we are running exactly an hour late. I know people are getting packaged, so we're just putting some snacks out.
okay, that works, because I think the only two sections we have left are sex and the devil. So we can, I would say we can drop those, but I don't know that people want us to. Yes, we're kind of like Pinky and the Brain in that way. I lost my space. One of the things that would happen was you're walking down the street, you decide, hey, I'm feeling cute today. I don't know. I think I'm going to go become a witch. And you go to the local bar and you pick up the devil. And he comes and has sex with you, and his spooge is really fucking cold. But now you're a witch because you have that power that's transmitted from semi-divine spunk. And so the devil is like, hey, I've got this hot new witch. I need to show my witch booty off. So he invites over his friend, the Queen of the Fairies. It's like, hey, let's go to dinner with these new witches. And so one of the things the witches did was they would go into the underworld with the devil, and they would meet the Queen of the Fairies. They would get additional magic from the Queen of the Fairies, and they would eat with the fairies and the dead. And so this is another way in which the dead were tied historically to witches specifically. That wasn't something that your cunning folk or your other magicians were doing. That was something that was kind of just a witch thing. So, the fucking devil. We're at that point now.
Specifically the fucking one.
He comes cold inside people. He's a fucking devil. So, the devil, Satan, and Lucifer. Historically, are not the same. And personally, I approach them as not being the same. You get some magicians who do. Jason Miller, for instance, his If you haven't done his Sorcery of the Devil Arcane Audio, I highly recommend it. It's very good. Jason understands them as being the same. He recognizes that historically they're different, but when he's asked, the answer was basically like, all these things, they all kind of are me, but not necessarily that was always the case, but people have come to understand them and everything blends together, and now, I'm all those things. That is at least my interpretation of how he describes what he was told.
And Steve, they didn't Crowley have like Iowan is Lucifer and like Hadid is the devil or Satan or something like that, like in the Liber Abba chapter on black magic?
He might have. That sounds familiar, but not something I paid a lot of attention to.
He's like, the devil is historically the god of many people that one person is like, this has led to so much confusion that the Beast 666 has preferred to let names stand as they are, and to proclaim simply that Iowa is the solar phallic hermetic Lucifer is his own holy guardian angel, and the devil, Satan, or Hadid of our particular unit of the starry universe. This serpent Satan is not the enemy of man, but he who made gods of our race, knowing good and evil, he bade know thyself and taught initiation. He's the devil of the Book of Thoth, and his emblem is Baphomet. The androgyne, he's the hieroglyph of arcane perfection.
There you go.
So Crowley also differentiated in that there's Iowas and Hadid and the devil of Baphomet.
And but he equates the serpent.
Yes.
Which is interesting. Because the Nachash, the serpent, is also traditionally a separate thing, but in most of Christianity has become one the same with the devil, Satan, and Lucifer. In medieval magic books, Satan and Lucifer feature, the devil does not. In collections of magical folklore, you don't find Satan and Lucifer, but you do find the devil. Because the devil was not always an evil or a maligned figure in European folk consciousness. When you look at the folk traditions of Europe, even up into the modern age, the devil is not necessarily a positive figure, but he exists in a space between being a positive and a negative figure. The devil is the black man of the forest, or the lord of this world, the ruler of wild places, and of those border spaces. It shows up frequently in folk spells and folk charms throughout Europe. If you look in the black books, there are often spells to conjure the devil. There's nothing in there about working with Satan or about working with Lucifer, but you'll still conjure the devil. There, in some communities in Europe, there are folk traditions where on certain days, and actually it's one of them in, I think, either Spain or Portugal, is a seashore tradition, where you go out and I think you give things to the devil in exchange for things that you need, and it's just like a normal part of the culture. Because the devil is almost like a way of incorporating wild nature spirits, as opposed to explaining the operation of Satan as the tempter in the world. The devil makes deals with people. The devil tries to open people up to the things that they desire and the things that they want, but it's not in the same malicious way that Protestant Christianity and to this point now modern Catholicism have kind of taken the devil and Satan and equated them as the adversary of mankind. The devil is not specifically adversarial. The devil's a little more neutral than that. The Crossroads devil in the United States, is that the same as the devil that we see in European traditions, or is that something that stems from African traditions? A lot of what we see the Crossroads devil do is super similar to what the devil of the forest does in Europe. There is a French love charm that uses a cat bone, very similar to popular hoodoo love charms using cat bones. And in the French love charm, it's done through work with the devil. The Greek magical papyri also has a cat bone charm, which is very similar to the frog bone charms that we see throughout Europe. One of the earliest recordings is in Pliny. And the charm in the United States is almost identical to the French charm that is almost identical to charms that occur throughout Europe. and it incorporates the devil behaving in a way that's almost the same as the way the devil behaves throughout Europe.
Almost like that.
Yes, so that makes it look like the hoodoo devil or the crossroads devil is the same devil that we have in European folklore. There are some blues scholars that have noted that the imagery in the blues that talks about the devil is totally about the crossroads devil and matches up to the way that he appears in European folklore. That none of it matches up with the way that crossroads figures work in African systems. There's musical associations with the crossroads figures in African systems that are not at all like the blues, which is the music that we associate in the United States with the crossroads devil, and certain strains of rockabilly. And blues musicians classically thought of themselves as children of the devil because of the behaviors in the dancing that was associated with the music. Yes.
So obviously, you have like voodoo traditions and like both European and West African influence. And there's Papa like crossroads figure there. Would you say that he's more in the European or African style, or is he
Legba, there are African figures that he derives from very clearly, but some of the ways that he's worked with in the Americas are different than the ways that he's worked with Africa. Some of the imagery is a little bit different, but it's clearly derived from that Legba figure. Legba is one of the figures that people try to associate with the Crossroads Devil, but there doesn't seem to actually be an association. They're just both Crossroads figures that may have a bit of a trickster element to them. So when looking at the Crossroads Devil in hoodoo or looking at the European devil from folklore, does that inform our understanding of witchcraft? I think yes and no. I have always found like a weird way of, like, when I think about the Crossroads Devil in hoodoo and how he's worked with, I'm like, it doesn't feel the same as working with the devil in witchcraft. But they probably are the same or similar figures. I think just the way that they operate is different based on the context. Typically, when you're dealing with the devil in like a hoodoo context, the devil is teaching you a skill. You go, you make some offerings, you say some things to call the devil, and you present to him something that represents the skill that you want to learn. The devil messes with it a little bit, gives it back to you, and that imparts the knowledge in order to do that skill to you. The devil in witchcraft teaches witchcraft, but not by way of you hand the devil your book of shadows and he hands it back and now you suddenly use witchcraft. It's more the devil shows up and works spells with you, teaches you spells, gives you spirits to work with that are going to teach you magic. In witchcraft, the devil is involved in a transmission of power, which doesn't happen with the Crossroads Devil. But I think that, again, probably the same sort of figure or the same figure, identical figure, but they're operating in a different way because the needs of the person and the type of magic they're working are going to be different. Did witches worship the devil? So again, this is one of the things that has the neo-pagans that don't like Sabrina super up in arms. They're like, oh my god, they're eating people and worshiping the devil.
Hey, have you ever had one pig?
I have not.
Come on over to my house.
This is clearly fantasy, clearly not witchcraft, because we're pagan. We don't believe in Satan. He's a Christian god. Well, if you're a polytheist, why not believe in gods of other cultures? Like, why not believe in Satan? But a lot of witches in Europe were probably Catholic, so they probably did believe in the devil, but they probably didn't worship the devil. The devil is still a figure that exists in the Catholic worldview up to today as something that can be interacted with for certain purposes. When you look at a lot of folklore books or folk magic books, they have spells for working with the devil. Even if you have witches that were not falling within the purview of Catholicism in the late medieval through early modern periods, then if they weren't Catholic, we don't really know what they were. Like, religion at the time wasn't necessarily something that people elected. It was just sort of, you live in this place, this is the religion that's in that place. So they probably believed all sorts of different folk things. But those folk things probably were not having an illicit underground religion of worshiping the devil. Because it's like, how is that going to be useful to them? That's the kind of thing that we start to see coming in fin de siècle French occultism. Initially, it's something that's levied as an accusation by one occultist against another as they sort of duke it out with each other over whose books are the books people should buy. Because initially they were all good Christians. Around that time. Huysmans is sort of like the second phase of that, where the devil worship stops being an insult and starts becoming in vogue. And so the later phase of that, that's where you start getting where it's like, hey, maybe there is something to this and we should do this spooky devil shit. I think you get more of that there than you get in historical things. Even if you look at like the affair of the poisons, there's she's killing people for money. She's a poisoner. She's not like, I'm running this illicit underground cult of devil worship. That's probably an accusation.
There's
like,
edges of that.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems pretty well tested. The thing I say, referencing your earlier comment on how fiction can play out, and how there's a certain point at which you've had 2 centuries of witchcraft narrative. It's published in pamphlets.
Yeah.
I mean, from 1550 on, broadsheets and pamphlets are extremely common and can be purchased by almost anybody. So you have accounts of trials that people have been reading for 150 years. They start to shape their beliefs and their practices around, well, this is obviously what you're supposed to do if you want to get power from the devil. And I mean, you start to see that with like Cagliostro and figures like that. They're clearly drawing on the fact that everybody knows how witches are supposed to act and how the devil acts.
Yeah, and that makes sense, and that's essentially what I'm advocating doing, is going back and looking at the historical record and trying to piece out what makes sense as reality versus what makes sense as just sensationalism and accusations. So yeah, I mean, there could have been people doing that too. I think it's hard to say whether or not anyone was worshiping the devil, because there's not like books written by witches of this is how you worship the devil and this is what our devil church did. But the churches of darkness in Sabrina are pretty cool. It'd be neat if they were there. We already talked about sort of the overlap between fairy faith and things that were reported in the trials. Lucifer and the Nephilim. Told you. I'm assuming most people are familiar with the story in Genesis that angels came down, they saw women were beautiful, they had sex with them, taught them witchcraft, taught the men smithing and war, and caused all sorts of general fuckery. And they had babies that were giants, and God and the angels are like, holy fuck, what the fuck is happening down there? Let's flood the earth and kill everybody.
Exactly how he said it?
God curses a lot.
Give or take.
Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly how it went.
So, as that story gets expanded in the apocryphal texts, you get a lot more information on the types of magic that they're doing. And generally, it's actually more like what people today call scholastic image magic or Arabic image magic. It has to do with creating talismans that trap the power of the stars, which would have been sinful because the stars are supposed to stand before the face of God, honoring God at all times. And so capturing the stars prevents them from doing that. There's also sort of, at the time that the Apocrypha were being written, Judaism had a very anti-astrology point of view, and so any magic that was astrological would have been against Judaism. But in the stories, they make women into witches, they make men into like these smiths that fight things. And and then they all die. But you get people who want to use that as an explanation for witchcraft. This is like Peter Gray writes from this perspective. Paul Huson's Mastering Witchcraft touches on this idea of witches as descended from the Nephilim. There's a few other forms of non-neo-pagan witchcraft that draw from this. I've never liked it as the basis for an explanation of where witches come from because it's not really a European story, so it sort of cuts out, like, well, where's the witchcraft before Europe becomes Christian? Although if you take that perspective, it doesn't matter that Europe wasn't Christian yet because all people came from those people. Lucifer is not actually part of the story, either in the Apocrypha or in, like, Genesis. But Lucifer is often treated as the progenitor of witchcraft when using this model. And if you ignore the fact that God floods the earth and kills all the Nephilim, it works as a story and can be a fun story. I don't know why I dislike the story so much, but
always a survivor.
so one of the Nephilim snuck onto the ark and became the witch father.
Slightly too much like the White Wolf.
And
Much like Amy Batman.
I think for me it's like I always am like, no, just let's go with Helios. Then there is the connection between the devil and pagan gods. Pagans like to talk a lot about the devil being a way that Christians rewrote pagan gods to demonize them. I think this idea can be somewhat problematic because we frequently see Christianity absorbing pagan gods, traditions, places, almost as much as we see them demonizing it, if not more often than we see them demonizing it. As you get to Northern Europe and you have the fairy faith, there's elements where the fairies aren't even they don't turn the fairies into saints, they just say, well, once Christians got here, the fairies became Christians too. And so there's lots of times where there is an effort to absorb or an effort to retain instead of just to demonize things. This idea that the devil was a demonization of nature spirits is also based in the idea that Lucifer, Satan, and the devil are the same, which at the time this was happening would not have been the understanding of any of those figures.
But my interjection is you take horn gods like Kernos and Pan, and those are the ones that you yourself call
Right.
devil.
And there definitely is a relationship there between the devil and those gods, but I don't think it's necessarily the same process as demonizing them.
But the horn's association with the devil dates back to Azazel and the ceremony that
With the goat.
which predates in the pagan process.
Well, predates the interconnection between the two. Yes. So yeah,
People have put horns on their gods since roughly Neolithic times.
yes, horns are
Something we can get from Keith.
gods are horny. The idea of the adversary is different than the idea of the devil. And the idea of the adversary does come from paganism. Judaism, the adversary is just someone who is a prosecutor. It's just someone who says, hey, people do these sinful things. It's bad that people do these sinful things. And in particular, it's primarily Persia and Rome do sinful shit and are awful, and God, you should destroy Persia and Rome because they're the enemies of Israel. That's what the Satanim are for. In Christianity, we get the idea of the adversary as someone who's set against mankind to trick and trap mankind and take mankind away from God. Christianity first develops that idea in the Gnostic forms of Christianity, in which you have this dualism between the actual God and the evil God, the true world and the false world. And Gnosticism most likely takes that dualism from Zoroastrianism, where you have a battle for the souls and the destiny of mankind in the world between a God of light and goodness and a God of darkness and evil. Zoroastrianism is essentially a monotheistic development of Aryan paganism, which is pretty much an expression of what most of the rest of Indo-European paganism was. So the idea of Satan as the adversary of mankind trying to take man away from God and pervert man into darkness is sort of a pagan idea, but not in the way that it's generally treated in neo-pagan criticisms of Christianity. But again, the devil isn't the adversary, but the devil does look like pagan gods. And I think that the reason for this is because it was a way of understanding nature spirits and wild gods within a Catholic worldview. So a folk Catholic worldview embraces all phenomenon that we know from our folk history to be true as still being true within the context of Catholicism. It's just now it's all Catholic. So when you have other spirits or you have magic or things that are being done that are not necessarily fitting within mainstream Catholicism, but your folk memory tells you, well, this stuff is real, then it's like, oh, it is real, and it's just under the purview of God. And these things are just also Catholic, and so it's okay. And you'll see a lot of traditional cultures where this happens, where you have folk Catholicism sort of not even like doing gymnastics to make this stuff work. They just are like, yeah, it works. And I think that's much the way that the devil plays in a lot of historical European culture, is that the devil is something where it deals with those same wild powers that Pan would be dealing with out in the forest and the field. It deals with that same liminal space that Kanunos would be dealing with between the animal and the man. It deals with the same wild ecstasy and liberation that Dionysus deals with through the mystery traditions. And I think an important part of this is that those gods which relate to those things are also gods that are connected with the sense of being othered and with being outsiders. Pan doesn't get to go hang out with the rest of the gods because he's beastly looking. Dionysus is supposed to be the inheritor of the throne of Zeus, but he's kind of cast out to walk amongst mankind, but mankind doesn't want to accept him either. And then you have connections between Dionysus and Pan also, particularly in how Dionysus grows up. Those gods also then relate to the mysteries, and the mystery traditions relate to those same chthonic elements of dealing with the dead and dealing with the underworld that then relate to witchcraft in Greece. So you have a natural overlap there. I don't think we need to talk about it in modern witchcraft too much. And so then we can stop here and get ready for the ritual, or we can talk about sex and sexuality.
Maybe
It's up to you guys.
Oh yeah, we could do that. We could, once the feast starts, we could resume with that last segment if we want to get to the ritual.
Food and sex together, that's like.
All right.